My name is Miller Files, and this is one of those cases that forces you to confront the line between the visible world and the hidden one. There are crimes committed out in the open, in broad daylight, where chaos bursts like a gunshot and leaves no room for doubt. And then there are crimes like this, crimes that grow quietly, like mold under wallpaper, crimes that depend on silence, on stigma, on the belief that certain people can simply vanish without anyone asking why. Before the name Herb Baumeister ever crossed my desk, before Fox Hollow Farm became synonymous with death, what we had was a string of disappearances that, at the time, seemed unrelated. They were written off with explanations that felt comfortable but unexamined. Young men leaving home, young men running away, young men moving on without a word. It was a story told too easily and believed too quickly. When I first pulled these case files from the archive, what struck me was not the details of the disappearances, but the tone of the reports. They were thin, clinical, almost resigned. Several men hadn't been seen for weeks, then months. And yet the urgency on paper felt diluted. The police officers who wrote them weren't incompetent. That wasn't the issue. It was the era. Early 1990s, America wasn't kind to the LGBTQ community. Many families hesitated to report a missing son, afraid of what the investigation might reveal about his life, and many officers assumed these men had simply left voluntarily. If they had walked out of a bar one night and never returned, well, maybe they didn't want to be found. That was the thinking. That was the blind spot. And into that blind spot stepped a man who lived two lives with terrifying ease. Before we go into who Herb Baumeister was, you need to understand Indianapolis at that time. The city was growing, businesses booming, and nightlife developing in a way that made people believe the future was bright. But beneath the bright signs and busy roads were pockets of life that lived by different rules. The gay bars, scattered around downtown, were sanctuaries for some, escape routes for others, and hunting grounds for one man. What made these disappearances so difficult to notice was the fluidity of the environment. People came and went. They drifted between states, between clubs, between apartments and couches and friend groups. For a predator, it was the perfect setting. For us, it was a nightmare. One of the earliest cases I examined was a young man named Michael. He was 22, employed part-time, described by friends as quiet but kind. He disappeared after leaving a bar with someone they couldn't identify. A vague description, a car no one remembered clearly, no video surveillance in the early 90s to capture the moment. The case stalled. Another file belonged to a man named Allen, same age, same last known location, same uncertainty. What connected these cases wasn't obvious at the time. It wasn't evidence. It wasn't witness statements. It was absence. The absence of bodies, the absence of answers, the absence of answers. The absence of urgency. It took years for people to realize that silence itself can be the loudest warning. Before 1992, these disappearances accumulated like dust on a shelf. Then something changed. The pace increased, more names, more faces. The pattern sharpened, though still hidden beneath assumptions. I spoke years later with some of the detectives involved at the time. Many of them said the same thing. They felt something was wrong, but couldn't prove it. No one had a crime scene. No one had a body. All they had was a handful of missing men who moved within the same social circles. Without a body, you don't have a homicide. Without a homicide, you don't have resources. And while hesitation grew within law enforcement, confidence grew within the killer. Meanwhile, in a different part of Indianapolis, A very different picture of the same man was being painted. Herb Baumeister, local businessman, owner of a small chain of thrift stores, married, father of 3, described as eccentric by some, distant by others, but never dangerous. People said he was odd, but harmless, that he struggled socially, but meant well. His store employees remembered him as tense and unpredictable, but nothing in their stories pointed to the kind of darkness that would later emerge. That's the thing about dual lives. From the outside, the first life is convincing. From the inside, the second life is consuming. Herb had a history of unusual behavior long before the disappearances began. As a child, he exhibited signs of obsession with death that unsettled his classmates. He would leave dead animals on desks. He spoke often about the human body. These behaviors were concerning, but not enough at the time to raise alarms. As he grew older, his strange tendencies were overshadowed by his attempts to fit in, to build a life that society approved of. He married. He had children. He started a business. But even as he built that façade, the cracks widened. Those close to him described mood swings, bouts of anger, long periods of withdrawal. A man who wanted to appear normal while hiding something fractured within himself. In 1993, investigators received their first real break, though no one realized its importance immediately. A man came forward, shaken, claiming he had encountered someone dangerous. He described a middle-aged man who had taken him to a private location and exhibited violent behavior. He escaped, but only barely. His description was detailed enough to raise suspicion, but not enough to secure a warrant. Without physical evidence, the case was recorded but not pursued aggressively. Still, it was the first time the predator's mask had slipped, and it wouldn't be the last. More disappearances followed. More families waited for answers that never came. By this point, some in the community started connecting dots, even if law enforcement had not. Patrons at the bars whispered to one another. They warned newcomers not to leave alone with strangers. Some mentioned a man who seemed too eager, too insistent, too persuasive. A man who appeared ordinary at first glance, but set off alarms in those who trusted their instincts. Rumors spread, but rumors alone cannot stop a killer. At the same time, the Baumeister family purchased a new property, Fox Hollow Farm, a sprawling 17-acre estate with dense trees, wide fields, and a sense of isolation tailor-made for secrets. The house had an indoor pool, tall ceilings, long hallways, and a remoteness that felt intentional. It was the kind of place where you could scream and no one would hear you. It was the kind of place where the fadid of a perfect suburban life could be maintained without anyone noticing what happened after the sun went down. The first moment that Fox Hollow Farm entered the investigation was not through police work, but through a child's curiosity. One afternoon, the Baumeister's son stumbled across a human skull while playing in the woods on the property. He brought it inside, confused but unafraid, and showed it to his mother. She confronted Herb, who assured her it was an old anatomical specimen he had found years earlier. His explanation was delivered calmly, casually, with just enough detail to make it believable. And because no one wanted to consider the alternative, the matter was dropped. This, to me, is the moment that defines the entire early stage of the Baumeister case, an opportunity to uncover the truth, smothered by the desire to avoid it. For investigators, these years are the most frustrating. So many clues hiding in plain sight, so many chances to intervene before the body count rose. But hindsight is its own kind of cruelty. You see the picture clearly only when it's too late to change its course. By 1994, The disappearances could no longer be ignored. Families pushed harder. Activists began to speak publicly about the pattern they saw. The community's voice grew louder, and eventually law enforcement listened. Detectives began revisiting old missing persons cases, looking for similarities. They found them: a consistent timeline, a consistent geography, a consistent type of victim, and overlapping witness descriptions that finally pointed toward a suspect. That suspect was Herb Baumeister. But suspicion is not evidence, and evidence was still non-existent. It wasn't until 1995 that investigators finally gained enough leverage to pursue Herb more aggressively. The breakthrough came from the same man who had previously escaped him. Now, more confident, he gave additional details, narrowing down the identity of the man who had nearly killed him. Cross-referencing his account with bar staff and other patrons brought one name into sharp focus, and for the first time, detectives requested to search Fox Hollow Farm. Herb refused. It was his right. Without probable cause, investigators couldn't force their way in. His refusal only deepened their suspicion, but legally their hands were tied. They watched, they waited. They built their case quietly, methodically. Meanwhile, Herb continued living his life, unaware that the shadows he had thrived in were beginning to shrink. In the background of all this, another chilling possibility was being discussed: the I-70 Strangler, a separate series of murders that had occurred years earlier, involving young men whose bodies had been dumped along highways in Indiana and Ohio. Some investigators believed the same killer could be responsible for both sets of crimes. Others dismissed the theory, but the parallels were undeniable. Same demographic, same pattern of disappearance, same geographic overlap. Whether Herb was involved was a question that loomed heavily in every meeting room where his name appeared. As this first episode closes, what we have is a city waking up to the horror that had been unfolding quietly for years. A list of missing men that grew too long to ignore. A suspect whose carefully crafted life was beginning to unravel. A property that held more secrets than anyone could have imagined. And a predator whose confidence came from the belief that no one was looking for him. But we were. And in Episode 2, the investigation steps onto the grounds of Fox Hollow Farm for the first time, pulling back the curtain on what had been hidden in the trees, the soil, and the silence. In every investigation, there comes a moment when the landscape shifts, a moment when suspicion is no longer theoretical, when hidden truths begin to push through the cracks of a carefully constructed lie. For us, that moment came when Fox Hollow Farm stopped being just a property and became a character in the story. A character that had been silent for years, holding its breath beneath piles of leaves and soil and forgotten remains. It had watched everything. It had absorbed the footsteps of men who never walked out again. And now, for the first time, the investigation was turning its gaze toward it. I remember staring at the aerial photographs of the estate. 17 acres, thick wooded areas to the north, a clearing to the east, the long driveway that curved just enough to block the house from the road. It was isolation disguised as privacy, and for a man like Herb Baumeister, that distinction was vital. People often believe monsters hide in dark alleys, but the truth is they prefer comfort. They prefer homes with clean windows and trimmed hedges. They prefer a place where they control every variable. Fox Hollow Farm was the perfect mask, a family home on the surface, a tomb underneath. When investigators first returned their focus to the property, the question wasn't whether something terrible had happened there. The question was whether they would ever be allowed inside. Herb had made his position clear when detectives requested permission to search. He refused flatly, calmly, without panic. That calmness was what stayed with me. Innocent men react with confusion or indignation. Guilty men react with fear. But Herb didn't fit either pattern. His refusal was sterile, almost rehearsed, as if he had known long before that this request would come one day. A man who prepares for confrontation is a man who knows what he's hiding. Still, the refusal didn't bring the investigation to a halt. It only changed its direction. Detectives had two options: find probable cause or find a way around Herb entirely. And ultimately, it wasn't the police who provided the breakthrough, it was his wife. Julie Baumeister had spent years navigating a marriage filled with emotional distance and unexplained behaviors. Herb slept in a separate room. He disappeared at night without explanation. His drinking escalated. His moods fluctuated wildly. The strange stories she told later painted a portrait of a man walking a thin line between control and collapse. But she had also been the person to accept his explanation for the human skull found by their son. That moment haunted her, and in 1996, when she took her children away temporarily due to Herb's erratic behavior, she made a decision that changed everything. She granted investigators access to the property. A judge approved the search based on her consent, and with that, for the first time, law enforcement stepped into the place that had consumed so many men. The initial search was cautious. Investigators expected resistance from Herb, though he was not home at the time. They approached the grounds carefully, knowing the significance of the moment, but not the magnitude of what they were about to uncover. One detective later described the feeling as walking into a story that had been written but never read. The land felt heavy, as if it carried its own memory. They began outside. The wooded areas were the most logical place to search first. Underbrush thick as carpets, leaves layered so deeply that anything could be beneath them unseen. The team fanned out, scanning the ground for bone fragments or disturbed soil. It didn't take long. Within minutes, one detective noticed something white protruding from the ground. Not a full bone, just a shard, small enough to be mistaken for a stone, but shaped too distinctly to be ignored. When he picked it up, the weight told him the truth. It was human. More fragments followed. A piece of a rib, a tooth, something that might have been part of a vertebra. The ground wasn't a gravesite. It was a scatter field, a place where remains had been distributed over years, exposed to animals, weather, and time. No single body remained intact. Instead, the property held thousands of fragments, as if someone had deliberately broken down the evidence to erase identity itself. The discovery rippled through the team. They knew they had stepped into something far larger than expected. The search area expanded. Every few steps, another piece surfaced. A jaw fragment, a section of femur, charred bone that indicated fire had been used. Human remains were everywhere. I cannot emphasize enough how significant this moment was. After years of missing persons reports, years of whispers in bars, years of fear and unconfirmed rumors, the land itself was now speaking. It was telling the truth that no witness could articulate, and its truth was horrifying. Investigators later reported that more than 10,000 bone fragments were ultimately recovered. Some no bigger than a fingernail, others large enough to identify with relative certainty. But quantity was not the most disturbing detail. It was the presentation. The patterns indicated that the bones had not simply decomposed naturally. They had been altered, burned, crushed. Attempted to be concealed, Herb hadn't just killed. he had tried to erase, not just life, but identity. Inside the house, detectives found signs of a life that contradicted the horrors outside. Family pictures, children's toys, a business office with paperwork neatly stacked. Everything in its place, everything curated. But the more they explored, the more the mask began to slip. The indoor pool room, a central feature of the home, carried a sense of unease. High ceilings, echoing acoustics, windows that looked out into the woods. Some investigators believed this room served as a killing ground, a place where Herb lured men under the guise of privacy and pleasure, a place where his desire for control reached its peak. In later interviews, survivors described a pattern. Herb would engage them in erotic asphyxiation. He framed it as mutual desire. But during the act, something shifted. His grip tightened beyond safety. His eyes changed, and the survivor who had escaped him said he saw something in Herb that terrified him beyond reason, a kind of pleasure that came not from intimacy, but from dominance, a pleasure that needed to push boundaries until life itself gave way. As investigators began to understand this pattern, they returned to the bone fragments outside and imagined the unspoken truth. Many of those men had likely died in the pool room or somewhere else inside the house before being dragged outside to be disposed of like refuse. To understand this is to understand the duality of Herb Baumeister. Inside the house, he pretended to host. Outside the house, he performed extermination. When the first remains were found, Herb was informed that the police had conducted a search. He was not told the extent of what had been discovered. His reaction became a subject of intense scrutiny later. He did not confront the investigators. He did not demand explanations. He did not attempt to defend himself. Instead, he left. He walked out of the house, got into his car, and drove away from the life he had built. He never returned to Fox Hollow Farm again. That night marked the beginning of Herb's downfall, though even then, no one knew the full scale of the crimes they were dealing with. As the investigation deepened, so did the horror. Bones were boxed, cataloged, compared. Some matched known missing persons. Others belonged to unidentified individuals whose families still don't know where their sons are. DNA testing in the mid-1990s was limited, but even with those limitations, several victims were named. The rest remained whispers in the soil. The case drew national attention now. The once ignored disappearances were suddenly headlines. The community that had sounded the alarm years earlier felt vindicated, but devastation overshadowed any sense of victory. They had been right. Their friends had been taken. Their warnings had gone unheeded. For many, the discovery at Fox Hollow Farm was not closure, but the reopening of wounds they had never been allowed to express. The more investigators dug, the more questions emerged. How many victims were there? 11, 15, 25. The fragments suggested more than a dozen individuals, but without intact remains, estimations were nearly impossible. Some anthropologists believed the property contained the remains of up to 25 men. Others suggested fewer. But the truth is, bone fragments do not speak in numbers. They speak in absence. A particularly chilling point of interest came when investigators realized that many of the remains had been partially burned. The burn patterns were inconsistent with full cremation. Instead, they suggested efforts to destroy evidence using backyard fires that were never hot enough to complete the job. This indicated something key about Herb's psychology. He wasn't meticulous. He wasn't a criminal mastermind. He made mistakes, but his mistakes were covered by society's neglect of his victims. He got away with sloppiness because the world wasn't looking. Inside Herb's office, detectives discovered another disturbing detail. several books on serial killers, not unusual on their own. But the highlighted passages were telling. He had marked sections discussing how killers were caught, how patterns were identified, how victims were traced. It appeared Herb was studying not out of curiosity, but out of strategy. He wanted to know what investigators looked for, so he could avoid it. He underestimated, however, the one factor he could never control, the persistence of those who wanted answers. By the time the first week of searching concluded, the scale of the case was undeniable. Journalists camped outside the property. Helicopters hovered overhead. Families of missing men called daily, hoping for updates but bracing for the worst. The investigation had shifted from missing persons to serial homicide, and Herb Baumeister, once a respected businessman, was now the prime suspect in what would become one of the most disturbing serial killer cases in American history. But, as Episode 2 closes, the man responsible for the horrors discovered at Fox Hollow Farm was already gone. Somewhere out there, driving alone, watching news unfold, knowing the walls were closing in. His disappearance set the stage for a manhunt that would stretch across state lines and end in the most abrupt and unsatisfying way imaginable. In Episode 3, we follow the pursuit of Herb Baumeister as he flees Indiana, the psychology behind his escape, and the final moments before his life ends on foreign soil, leaving behind a trail of questions he never intended to answer. When a predator finally senses that the darkness he has lived in is beginning to crack open, his first instinct is almost never confession. Confession requires facing the weight of what he has done. No, the first instinct is escape, flight, a desperate attempt to outrun the truth. And that is exactly what Herb Baumeister did the moment he realized the walls around him were collapsing. Fox Hollow Farm had begun to reveal what lay beneath its soil, but Herb himself was no longer there to face it. He slipped away quietly, leaving behind a family fractured by fear, a police force scrambling to understand the magnitude of their discovery, and a city stunned into disbelief. In this episode, we follow the path of a man running from consequences he knew were inevitable. But unlike most fugitives who flee in panic, Herb's escape had an eerie calmness to it, as though he had rehearsed it many times in the quiet corners of his mind. The final days before his disappearance were marked by a strange stillness. After Julie, his wife, cooperated with law enforcement and allowed the search of Fox Hollow Farm, Herb's demeanor changed. Witnesses described him as strangely detached, almost floating through the last remnants of his life, without anchoring to anything. He didn't argue, he didn't shout, he didn't deny. It was as though he had already left before his body physically departed. Police surveillance began immediately after the remains were discovered. They could not arrest him yet, not officially, not without further evidence linking him directly to the deaths, but they monitored him closely. The search of the property had only just begun, and although the fragments found on the land were harrowing, it would take days to identify them and build a prosecutable case. In that fragile space between suspicion and certainty, Herb made his move. One morning, he simply vanished. His car, a gray 1990 Buick, was gone from the driveway. His phone lay on the kitchen counter, battery removed. His wallet was partially emptied. His clothes were missing. But the house was left in an unsettling order, like someone making sure the stage looked tidy before walking off it permanently. Police quickly issued a regional alert. They contacted state lines. They notified Border Patrol, but the United States is vast, and a single man driving alone on open highways can disappear like a ripple sinking into the surface of a lake. They had no idea where he was headed. His credit cards were unused. His bank accounts remained untouched. He had ghosted himself from his financial identity. The manhunt began. While investigators scoured Fox Hollow Farm for remains, another team traced Herb's possible routes. There were sightings, some credible, some not. A man resembling Herb eating alone in a diner. A man checking into a motel under a false name. A man sleeping in his car at a rest stop. By the time police arrived at each location, the man was gone. What struck me as I reviewed these accounts was the pattern. Herb was moving north, away from Indiana, away from everything familiar, away from the weight of his crimes. There was no evidence he intended to return. Those who flee often leave breadcrumbs behind phone calls, ATM withdrawals, attempted goodbyes. Herb left nothing. A psychiatrist later speculated that Herb entered what is known as a dissociative state, a psychological shutdown where a person detaches from their identity as a form of self-preservation. But dissociation alone does not explain the choices Herb made. A man in that state doesn't typically plan. He withdraws. He spirals inward. But Herb's journey was deliberate. He was headed to Canada. Crossing the border in the mid-1990s was less regulated than it is today. A man traveling alone, quietly, with no criminal record on file, attracted no attention. He drove through the night, stopping only to sleep in his car. One witness recalled seeing him at a gas station near Detroit. He looked tired, unshaven, but calm. Too calm, considering what he was leaving behind. Part of me believes Herb felt a sense of relief once he left Indiana, as though distance from the crime scenes meant distance from the guilt. But guilt does not shrink with distance. It grows. Meanwhile, back in Indianapolis, forensic teams were uncovering more and more evidence of the horrors Herb had committed. Thousands of bone fragments, charred remains, personal items belonging to the missing. Each discovery tightened the noose around Herb's fleeing silhouette. Every hour that passed made it more certain. He would be charged with multiple homicides. There was no other outcome waiting for him, except the one he chose. Herb crossed into Ontario, Canada, and continued driving north until he reached Lake Huron. He eventually stopped near Pinery Provincial Park, a large forested reserve known for its quiet trails, pine trees, and isolated dunes. It was a peaceful place, serene in a way that stood in violent contrast to the chaos he had left behind. He checked into a motel under a false name. For days, he wandered the park alone. Hikers later reported seeing a man sitting at picnic tables, staring into the distance. A man walking along the shoreline in shoes not meant for sand. A man writing in a notebook. During this time, news of the Fox Hollow Farm discoveries had spread nationwide. Herb's name was now associated with the remains of potentially dozens of missing men. Some media outlets called him a serial killer. Others used the term mass murderer. Some held back until formal charges could be filed. But the world was learning the truth, and Herb was watching the coverage alone, miles from home. His final act unfolded quietly. He drove to a remote sand dune area within the park. The date was July 3, 1996. He sat inside his car, rolled down the windows, and took out a .357 Magnum revolver he had brought with him. He placed a handwritten suicide note on the passenger seat. In the note, he blamed stress, financial issues, and the breakdown of his marriage. Not once did he mention the murders or the bodies found on his property. Not once did he express remorse or explanation. It was the final manipulation, a refusal to acknowledge the truth, even in death. Then he shot himself. His body remained undiscovered for 2 days, hidden in the quiet isolation he had chosen for his final moments. Campers stumbled upon the car, notified authorities, and only then did the manhunt end. Not with an arrest, not with a confession, but with a corpse. When news returned to Indiana, investigators were furious, not because Herb was dead, but because his death stole answers from the victims' families. It stole the possibility of confession. It stole accountability. It sealed the truth inside the mind of a man who refused to give the world closure. A dead suspect cannot stand trial. A dead suspect cannot explain his actions. A dead suspect cannot reveal how many victims remain unidentified. A dead suspect cannot say whether he also committed the I-70 Strangler murders. With Herb's suicide, every unanswered question became permanent. But the investigation did not die with him. In fact, it intensified. The search at Fox Hollow Farm continued. Forensic analysts worked tirelessly to identify the remains. Anthropologists studied bone fragments for patterns. The FBI consulted on psychological profiling. Families submitted DNA samples, hoping, praying, preparing for the worst. And through all this, one haunting truth emerged. Herb Baumeister had controlled every moment of his crimes. But his final act was also an act of control, robbing investigators of the chance to confront him. A killer seeks dominance. Even in his final breath, Herb maintained it. I remember reading his suicide note for the first time. The handwriting was neat. The tone detached. There was not an ounce of humanity in it. It was the letter of a man who saw himself as the victim, a man unable to acknowledge the suffering he had caused, a man who believed death would allow him to slip away from accountability. He was wrong, because his death meant something else happened instead. With the killer gone, the spotlight shifted entirely onto the victims, onto their families, onto the countless men whose remains lay across the soil of Fox Hollow Farm. The world stopped focusing on Herb's name and began focusing on the lives he had taken. Still, the questions lingered. How many victims were there? What was the true extent of his crimes? Why did he choose the men he did? And perhaps the darkest question of all, were there more burial sites we had not yet found? Investigators gained a clearer picture as more remains were identified, but the scope remained chillingly broad. Even today, decades later, some of the bones recovered have still not been matched to known missing persons. Some families still do not know that their loved ones died at Fox Hollow Farm. Others suspect it, but lack the DNA evidence to prove it. The aftermath of Herb's suicide was not closure. It was a transition. A shift from the hunt for a killer to the search for truth. Episode 3 ends here with Herb's death. But death did not silence the case. It only removed the one voice that might have explained it. In the next episode, we examine the forensic battle to identify the victims, the painstaking work of reconstructing lives from bone fragments, and the horrifying discovery that the number of victims may be far greater than anyone imagined. When the killer dies before the truth is uncovered, the burden of storytelling shifts. It moves from the suspect to the soil, from the guilty to the dead. And at Fox Hollow Farm, the dead had a great deal to say. Their voices were not loud. They did not come in confessions or diaries or eyewitness accounts. Their voices came in fragments, literal fragments, thousands of bone shards scattered across a quiet stretch of land where a family once lived, unaware of the horrors beneath their feet. Episode 4 is not about Herb anymore. It is about the victims. It is about the forensic scientists who spent years piecing together lives from clues as small as a fingernail. It is about the families who waited for answers that sometimes came and sometimes never would. It is about the truth that reveals itself slowly, painfully, stubbornly, long after the killer is gone. The search at Fox Hollow Farm did not end when Herb pulled the trigger in Canada. In many ways, it had only just begun. When investigators returned to the property after confirming his death, they did so with a renewed intensity. The man they had been chasing was no longer the objective. The objective, now, was to give the victims back their names. I remember speaking to one of the forensic anthropologists who worked on the site. She told me that the moment she stepped onto the property, she knew it would stay with her for the rest of her life. It wasn't the scale of the crime scene that haunted her. It was the intimacy of it. Every bone belonged to someone who had once laughed, once loved, once walked into a bar, thinking the night might bring adventure or companionship. Instead, they met a man who saw them not as people, but as objects to be used and discarded. The anthropologist described how the first step in the analysis was simply gathering the remains. The sheer volume was overwhelming. Bone fragments covered not just one discrete location, but multiple areas across the property, near the woods, along the fence line, around fire pits, and even in shallow depressions in the soil. Some fragments were on the surface, bleached by sunlight. Others had sunk deeper, pressed by years of rain. Animals had scattered them. Fires had altered them. Time had worn them down. Forensic work is not glamorous. It is patient, repetitive, and precise. Scientists knelt for hours, gently brushing away dirt, separating bone from stone, cataloging each piece. Each fragment was placed in evidence bags, labeled with the exact spot where it was found, then taken to a temporary lab set up for sorting. Days stretched into weeks. Weeks stretched into months. Some bones were clearly human. Others required microscopic examination. The estimated total ultimately surpassed 10,000 fragments. No one had expected numbers like that. But numbers alone do not tell a story. To understand what happened, forensic analysts needed to reconstruct events as best they could. They studied burn patterns, how heat had warped or cracked the bones. They analyzed cut marks. They determined which bones belonged to which parts of the body. And slowly, patterns emerged. The first pattern, burning. Many fragments showed signs of exposure to fire, but these weren't cremations. Cremation requires temperatures far higher than any household fire can reach. Instead, the burns suggested backyard fires, fires hot enough to char the bone, but not hot enough to destroy it. This meant Herb had tried to eliminate evidence, but failed to understand the science behind it. He had burned bodies in pits or metal drums, then scattered the pieces. The second pattern, fragmentation, bones were found broken into pieces far smaller than natural decomposition would produce. This suggested intentional crushing, perhaps with tools, perhaps under vehicles, perhaps through repeated burning. The purpose was clear: destruction of identity. Herb wasn't just trying to hide bodies. He was trying to erase the men themselves. The third pattern, consistency. Among the fragments, certain anatomical parts appeared more frequently: small bones from hands, feet, ribs. Why some bones survived while others were missing entirely remains a matter of speculation. Perhaps some parts burned more completely. Perhaps animals carried others away. Perhaps Herb disposed of certain remains elsewhere. As forensic teams pieced together the physical evidence, detectives revisited the missing persons, cases now believed to be linked to Herb. Many families had submitted DNA years earlier. Others stepped forward only after media coverage intensified. Some waited in silence, torn between wanting closure and fearing it. DNA testing in the mid-1990s was not what it is today. It required larger samples, and degraded bone was especially difficult to test. Months passed before the first positive identification came through, and when it did, it shattered the room. The first victim identified was a young man last seen leaving a bar several years earlier. His family had held out hope, even as the years stretched on. But when investigators arrived at their home with the news, the hope collapsed into grief. They finally knew where he was. They finally knew what had happened. But they also knew the violence he had suffered, the indignity of his remains being burned and broken. It was closure, yes, but closure carved from pain. One by one, more identifications followed. Not many, not enough. Out of thousands of fragments, only a handful could be matched to specific individuals. The rest belonged to men whose names the world may never know. The forensic anthropologist I spoke with described the emotional toll this took on the team. Working with the dead becomes a kind of responsibility, a silent promise that even if they cannot speak, their remains will be treated with dignity. But the investigators also carried a heavy burden. The more they learned, the more they realized the full scale of the killings. Some estimates suggested up to 25 victims. Others argued for fewer. But the truth is that when a killer destroys evidence so thoroughly, any number is speculative. The only certainty is that many men died, and many families never received answers. As the forensic work continued, another thread resurfaced: the possible connection to the I-70 Strangler murders. These earlier killings involved young men found dumped along highways across Indiana and Ohio. The victims were similar in age and appearance to Herb's known victims. In some cases, the cause of death was strangulation. The geographic overlap was undeniable. Investigators began comparing timelines. Herb lived in the region during the I-70 murders. He fit the psychological profile. He had a history of violence long before the known killings at Fox Hollow Farm, and there were no signs that his killing career began suddenly in the early 1990s. Most serial killers escalate gradually. They do not wake up one day and decide to kill. They test, they experiment, they refine. And if the I-70 victims were indeed his early crimes, it would explain the jump in sophistication seen later. The murder scenes became more controlled, the disposal methods more deliberate, the confidence greater. But without a confession, the link remains unresolved. Some investigators believe wholeheartedly that Herb was the I-70 Strangler. Others caution that coincidence is not proof, and because Herb killed himself before questioning, the truth may never be known.